By golly.
Why are you doing that? Okay, but should you? Just because you can.
Oh, yeah, I got it.
Yes, I'm going to pick these up.
All right, y'all got everything taken care of.
Do what? The podcast? Yeah. Oh, there you go. I love Dan Carlin. Well, that's right. It's the same one. Like tomorrow will be the same one that I'm doing now. So. On 1968? No, but I'd like to. That was a heck of a year. I remember. Yeah, I have a memory of it for sure. Okay. Testing.
All right.
Thank y'all. Love y'all too. Y'all be great. Testing.
Test one. Beep, beep. Test. Morning. Good morning. Can anyone hear me? No. Well, that is the reason. Good morning. Oh, there we are. Please grab a Bible. Class will begin in a few minutes.
tapped in one side and it stopped.
So he was talking and sitting up when they picked him up. So.
Rich,
Hey, thank you. Y'all pivoted really well. Thank you.
it worked out. We happened to just have all we needed. That keyboard that we purchased on batteries. So it's able to just.
Well, you know, God gave us soft breezes too. It felt good. Could have been
Thank you so much, and I'll see you this week.
I'm glad this happened while you were back.
Yeah, I'm proud of the whole team. It all
Me
worked
too.
out.
Me too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And Corey. That was great. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. All right, y'all need a red or a black Bible because I'm going to call out page numbers. So if y'all ever miss this class, I'm going to turn this off because Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Bible Basics. I'm so happy to have you all here this morning, and also those who are viewing this through the live stream or through the podcast tomorrow. We're going to go through basic Bible things this fall to teach you how to read the book, which is not a book, but rather a library of books, where Bible means books. And so this is the second part of what we're as we talk about the four Gospels. When we take a break for the holiday next weekend, we'll have one service at 10 o'clock. We won't have Sunday school, and then we'll come back and I want to talk about St. Paul. So very foundational kind of stuff that we're going to cover in this class together. And I want to recap what we talked about last week, which is this. There are four stories of Jesus. There are four stories in the New Testament, this part of the library that we call the New Testament. And these four stories, the first three are really, really similar. They're called the synoptics, which simply sounds like a mouthful, but it's not. It just means they're seen with the same point of view, which also means that Matthew and Luke have all of Mark within them. So we think that Mark was written first, and it's the shortest of the four, but not because it's incomplete for any reason, but because it's tight. It's written like a well-written short story. So those first three are told a similar way. Also, as we remembered as we left the class, Mark was probably written around the year 70 at the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. You know, when things get torn up, things happen, opportunities happen. And so God's people went into exile 600 years before Jesus wrote the Bible, wrote the Old Testament. They lose the temple in 70, write the Gospels. I mean, when loss is a time of opportunity. And we know this too as we live in our post-pandemic world, right after the pandemic disruption. We've also seen opportunities in the midst of loss. And so Mark was written in 70 at the time of the destruction of the temple. Matthew and Luke written about a decade later to different communities. And then John, which is what we're going to cover today, is written at the turn of the first and second centuries. And so it's written around the year 100, which is a good bit of time after the event. Also, just as a recap, all four Gospels have a different voice, and they start in a different way. Matthew begins with a genealogy and an old man, Joseph. An old man who listens to his dreams. An old man who's a part of the story. He's an unimportant man, but he's a part of the story because he has a name, David. And the prophets would promise that Jesus would be, or the Messiah would return right in the line of David. And so it would take Mary to give Jesus life, but Joseph to give him a name, son of David, if you will. So there's Joseph. Mark begins with John the Baptist. There is no Christmas in the beginning of this gospel. Rather, Mark begins with the cousin John in the wilderness, for the simple reason that God was back in color, talking again, was talking through a prophet again, something that hadn't happened for 400 years. They never thought that they would have more than words on a page, and suddenly John the Baptist looks like Elijah, sounds like Elijah. Not that Mark doesn't have anything against Christmas, he just thinks that this is more important, that John the Baptist had returned in living color. Luke begins with an angel and a girl who says yes to this wild promise. And as such, the Virgin Mary becomes an embodiment of a promise made by the prophets to Virgin Israel, if you will. They'd always seen Israel as a virgin, and now a virgin in Nazareth would conceive and bear the Messiah. See how these go? They all have a different voice. They tell the same story from a different angle, if you will. And then John begins in outer space. And we're going to talk about John today. Now, John, as the latest gospel, is a gospel that's written while we've had some time to reflect. It is hard to comprehend what happens within a mere 70 years when it comes to the spread of the news of Jesus Christ to a hungry and waiting world. 70 years is not that long of a time, and yet 70 years is an amazing amount, a head-spinning amount of change. This movement of Jesus goes from being rural and small. Some of you have been to the Holy Land with me, and I love to point out that half the Gospels take place in a 10-mile arc on the shore of a lake, a little rural place called Galilee. It's a very Jewish story, only Jewish people and Jewish families who know each other, and it was Sabbath-oriented. In 70 years, suddenly this has become urban, it's become global, it's become predominantly Gentile and Sunday-oriented. All right, so by the time John's gospel is written, stuff has changed. They've had some time to consider. I'm going to get more into this when we talk about Paul, but John is written for people who process differently than Galileans. So, for instance, the first three Gospels, have a very Jewish orientation. I'm going to get into more of this too this morning. A very Jewish orientation of a very Jewish story. John's Gospel is written to Gentile processing people who have a different worldview and different philosophies that involve how they think. Y'all turn with me to John chapter 1. It's page 862. Page 862. And it's John 1:1. Actually, you know this. Usually we read this around Christmas time, especially at the beginning of lessons and carols. So the cadence of this should be familiar to you. Page 862. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. I wish I had a star field behind me. I should have, if I thought about it, I would have, right? It'd be cool. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Well, the word here is more than the speech of God. It's more than like a word or an alphabet. Rather, the word for it is logos, Logos, logos. And this is a Greek idea for the divine mind. It's similar to a Hebrew idea of Hebrew idea is wisdom, the wisdom of God. But what John proclaims from the very beginning is that God's own mind took on flesh. And if we want to know how God thinks, then we can simply look at Jesus, right? I have a little Birmingham analogy that I like to use. When I was a little boy in downtown Birmingham, I would be thrilled. I was from Bessemer. We'd thrilled to go to Loveman's to shop and shop for back to school. And then you're riding around downtown, and there were two statues that you really wanted to see. There was Vulcan up on the hill. And when I was a little boy, he had a lighted torch. Do y'all remember this? It was green all the time, except when somebody was killed, a traffic fatality, somebody was killed in a car wreck, it'd glow red, which is the most morbid thing any city father would ever think of. But of course, children were like, ooh, cool. And then, and the second statue was on the top of the Liberty National Building. And it was a replica of Lady Liberty, and it had real fire. And so I always thought that was like the real one. I thought that maybe New York was a copy because it didn't have a flame powered by Alabama natural gas. The problem with that one is you couldn't see it. It was too, you're on your street level and you're looking up, it was just too high. You couldn't see it. So in the 80s, maybe somebody had a bright idea of putting Lady Liberty out on 459. So she used to be on top of a building. Now you can see the artistry, the folds. She's the largest, I think, bronze replica of Lady Liberty anywhere. The folds of her cloth and sort of the details of her face. You can see her now. If you want to see what God is like, read the Gospels and see Jesus. This is what John's Gospel is proclaiming. Look at him. Watch him love, right? Watch him heal, and you'll know what God is like. Now, that's a very Bible way of looking at God, because we also have another origin, an origin way of looking at God. If you want to know what God is like or how God thinks, look at the Ten Commandments. 5,000 years ago, God took a new technology, writing, and with God's own finger wrote down 10 ends for creation. And the first 4 are union with God, and the last 6 are union with each other. And this is what the story is, again and again and again and again. It's always the same story. So John's Gospel has had time to think and reflect. Last week, we talked about a theme in the Gospels called the Messianic secret. And that simply means that Jesus is the loneliest guy in the world. Nobody gets it. Nobody understands who he is. They want him for the wrong reasons. They want to see a show. They want a miracle maybe, or healing for personal reasons. And then they want to make him a king maybe. Like here's a general who can heal his own army maybe, or even rise from the dead. I mean, he's always in danger. And in Mark's gospel, the only one who ever gets it is a Roman soldier who watches him die and says, truly this man is God's son. That kind of thing. No messianic secret in John's gospel. This gospel has had time to reflect, right? It's written 70 years after the event. They've had time to think about Jesus. They had time to watch Christian communities at work around Easter, if you will, the witness of the resurrected Christ. And so when you read this gospel, you are looking. You're an outside player watching a narrated event, and you know everything. You know how it's going to end. You know who this person is, and you can also see the people who don't see who he is. So the way that it's written is just different. It's a different device. Now, that's the first way that John is told differently. But I'm also, so we're basically watching events unfold from the outside, looking in and watching things happen. But there's another way, and it's an unfortunate anachronism, and I want to go ahead and address this so that we don't have to think about it anymore. But John has an unfortunate way of using the word Jews. Now, it's an anachronism, and I want to explain it to you, and then I want to take a sidebar and talk about anti-Semitism and the origins of it. The term Jews was not used in the early first century in the world of Jesus. There was no such word as that. There were many Judaisms, if you will. There were Pharisees and Sadducees and people called Essenes, or different sorts of Judaisms. To be more accurate, if you're going to tell the story in its context, you would say a Galilean or a Judean. That would be the accurate term. I also want to tell you all that Palestinian is not an original term to the early first century. That was a term given by Hadrian in the middle of the second century for Roman Palestina, if you will, and then later adopted by the British after World War I for just one of the tribal areas that they carved up and given as a gift to the people who had defeated the Ottoman Empire in that war. So even the word Palestine, if you see it in a hymn or something, is not really an accurate term. So there are lots of anachronisms in the Bible. And so what John did is use the term Jews as a device for disbelieving enemies. Remember, we're kind of outsiders watching this thing unfold. And so we see people who believe, see people who don't believe, but it's written for us who we believe. And so we just get to see Jesus in conflict with those who don't. All right, let's talk about anti-Semitism for a minute and why this is an unfortunate word. John meant no harm. John didn't mean for the word to be used that would be used later in Western civilization, if you will. But we'll go back to the beginning. So Romans, which is the world of Jesus lived as a constituent part of the Roman Empire, although in a very poor town and a poor part of it, Galilee. But Jesus lived in a world where Romans tolerated Judaisms. They tolerated ancient religions. They actually liked ancient religions. You could find plenty of Romans who would think that Judaism was pretty cool and would try to practice the ethic of the Ten Commandments and that sort of thing. They didn't like new religions, though, because they couldn't control it. New religions would be suspect, because you can't be sure if a new religion would be seditious or not. And so early on, after Easter, the earliest Christians were, first of all, were Jewish people. But even as the movement began to spread, Christian people in their earliest form considered themselves to be Jewish, a division of Judaism, a sect of Judaism, if you will, who simply believed that the Messiah, the promises of the prophets had come true in Jesus. So originally, our family origin is that of being, as St. Paul would say brilliantly, grafted onto a much older vine, which means that the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, our Bible too, we all get to call Abraham our father. Now that's how it started, but unfortunately, there ain't no fight like a family fight, and so for the first 3 centuries, there was an expulsion from the synagogues in some places, and then also, I think some of this had to do as much to do with security and even economic considerations, but Jewish people in the first 3 centuries of Christianity said very clearly to Rome, they are new. Okay, they are not us. This is not who we are. They are not us. And so in the early 4th century, which is the early 300s, with the arrival of an emperor named Constantine, who had a pretty surface, I think, conversion. Quite frankly, the famous story is that he painted crosses on the shields of his soldiers, and won a dynastic battle that secured him as the sole emperor of Rome, and pronounced an edict of toleration, because Christians for the first 3 centuries, they'd been considered new, and so they were subject to sort of sporadic persecutions. Some of that lions in the Colosseum kind of stuff. It didn't happen all the time, but it did happen. And so remember, there is no fight like a family fight, and so Christianity suddenly, with the arrival of Constantine and the successive emperors, ends up on top. It ends up becoming the religion of the official religion of the Roman Empire. It becomes something with status. The symbols begin to change. Some of you have been to Rome and you've seen the catacombs. Look carefully at Christian graffiti. The graffiti that you'll see from earliest Christianity would be things like a fish or a table or a shepherd or bread, this kind of stuff. Now, with Constantine, the symbol changes to a cross. And I love our St. Luke's cross. It's a beautiful cross, and I love to wear a cross. But the cross begs us this early question: who did this, right? And now you have a gospel that gives you a very clear answer. The enemies of Jesus did it. The Jews did it. See how that works? See how anti-Semitism becomes born, and it was never intended to be born this way. And yet, and as my friend Don, I have an Israeli buddy, if y'all are new to me and new to this, who we talk all the time, and he said, Rich, the Roman Empire never ended. It just became the church. And so there, we call this the problem of Constantine, because one of the problems is this address of 3 centuries of grievances in a wrong kind of way. And I'll be honest, I thought that this was an historical event until October 7th last year, and watching anti-Semitism rear its head under the guise of anti-colonialism or economics or whatever it happens to be, that sort of virulent evil, if you will, continues to rear its head ever since. And so part of our own origin story is enmeshed, if you will, with an unfortunate anachronism, and something that we must address again and again and again and again, so that our children always know that this kind of hatred is not natural, it's not moral, and it's not even a part of the fiber of who we are as the family of God. Well, that's just a sidebar. So just note that when you read John's gospel, it has a harsh ring to it. There have been times when I've read it and read scripture in church where it just hits like a heavy thud. I wish we could have a class or an addendum, each time we read it. Not John's fault. It's what we've done with it. Is that a fair origin of anti-Semitism? That kind of gets you. Just watch it and just know that it's everywhere. And I think I'm pretty close to how it got started. But there are other ways that John's different, and I want to talk about this now. Enough of that. I want to talk about John's meta-narrative. Now, again, that's a mouthful, but not really not. It simply means a meta-narrative means an overarching story. Okay, and the first 3 Gospels have the story of the Passover as their overarching story. I like to teach something called the biblical principle of repetition, which means that things seem to happen again and again and again over time. So, like, for instance, the 10 Commandments and the Incarnation could be seen as the same story. Or you might see one of the reasons why Jesus is so exciting in the Galilee is because Elijah and Elisha lived in the same place and did a lot of the same stuff. There's a story in Luke's gospel where Jesus raises a widow's child. And it's important that he raises this child because she has no means of support. There's no way she will survive the death of her own kid. They don't have Social Security in that way. Well, Elisha did the same thing 800 years before in the same place. And so they all said, a great prophet has arisen among us. It doesn't mean they have an incomplete idea of who Jesus is. It's just that God's working again. And we study these things because if God did something for them, God's going to do something for me. Well, the overarching story in the first 3 is Passover. Jesus becomes the Passover lamb. You remember the Passover? That's marking the escape from Egypt. God's people. We've seen the movie, right? God's people are rescued from Pharaoh, Yulebrenner, and then the green cloud comes out of the sky, right? And they have the meal together, and they paint the blood on the doorpost, and the angel of death passes them over. And so every year, ever since, right in the spring, they would commemorate the Passover. And we still commemorate the Passover with the Eucharist, our communion words are Passover words. As Jesus becomes the Passover sacrifice and the last sacrifice according to the book of Hebrews, which we'll study in Bible Basics. And I can go on and on. I love the way that Luke shapes his story. The last third of it is this long journey, last journey to Jerusalem, where he knows that he'll become the Passover sacrifice to die. There you go. That's another meaning of the cross. John's meta-narrative is different. First of all, if you were to read the synoptics, they would give you the impression that Jesus goes for one dramatic showdown, which would be the Passover story. In John's gospel, Jesus is in Jerusalem all the time. And so the festival is different. The meta-narrative is different. Where the synoptics talk about the Passover, John's gospel talks about Sukkot. Let me tell you about the festivals. So Judaism was a cool, first century Judaism was a cool religion. I imagine the Romans were just scratching their heads at how crazy this world would be. If you lived in the Galilee, you would walk for 5 days at least once once a year in your lives. 3 if you could swing it, and so you'd walk to Jerusalem for 5 days at least 3 times a year, hopefully 3. So you'd have Passover in the spring, 50 days later Pentecost. All of these are harvest festivals, and they're fun. That's another, I think, Sunday school misperception I had was that, man, you got to walk 5 days and then go to church. Oof. No, this is like wine and family and intergenerational, and see people the same, year after year after year, and so. So you go Passover and you go to Pentecost, and then in the fall is Sukkot. And they would build booths like Sukkot, which would represent their wanderings in the wilderness and God's provision. And the Sukkot, and it's a fun one. It's kind of like, if you've ever been to the Grove at Ole Miss, it's like that. And it's just like it's like a big tailgate. It's crazy. And on the last day of the festival, the high priest would go down to the pool Siloam. Now I want you to imagine that the temple is there's a word that we throw around called an acropolis. So we think that the acropolis is only in Athens. Actually, an acropolis is any temple on the highest place. And so the temple is an acropolis. It's on this highest hill, if you will, overlooking the city. And it's about a 300-foot drop. Pretty steep, too, if you've ever walked it with me. So he would go down to the pool Siloam, and he would draw water out of this beautiful bathing pool, and then he would climb the hill up to the temple, and this is the last day of the festival, and he would pour water over the altar, and he would call it living water. Now, I want y'all to turn with me to John chapter 7, the 37th verse. John 7, 37, and it's on page 869. See, now you know something. You know about the meta-narrative. You know it's different. Now this is going to make sense. On the last day of the festival, the great day, while Jesus was standing there, he cried out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." And I said this about the Spirit, which believers in him were to receive, for as yet there was no Spirit, because Jesus was not yet glorified. I'm going to read this one more time. Out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. Okay, I hope you can see, by the way, while we're teaching this class, I'm talking about the way that the first 3 Gospels describe Jesus, and how John is different, and how it's a different festival, and perhaps it's got more time to reflect upon the divinity of Jesus, or the Logos become flesh. You can see now the difficulty of a literal reading of Scripture. There are Christians who just say, wait, every word in there is true, I'm just going to believe the story. Well, if you read it that way, then the Gospels can seem to contradict each other. They're told in a different way. I do remember a bumper sticker that I wish I had. I saw it in North Alabama. It was a preacher's parking spot at the hospital. They gave us clergy parking. At UAB, they give you nothing. But clergy parking in Decatur, you're like a rock star. And so it was like a big Lincoln Continental, and it had a bumper sticker that said, "If it ain't King James, it ain't Bible." That's right. There you go. Ain't Bible. That's why I want it. And anyway, so a literal reading of the Bible, it's just kind of difficult. But I want to remind you of a couple of things. One is that the Bible is full of block logic as opposed to linear logic. And this is a gift, I think, of the Hebrew sages, and it's also a very probably smart way to live. Linear logic goes like math. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Tie up and a bow. You don't have to think about it anymore. It's just unassailable. Block logic works like this. Read the book of Exodus sometime. Pharaoh hardened his heart and didn't let God's people go. Okay? God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh didn't let people go. They say both. The Exodus says both. Now the question is, which is it? And the rabbis would say, which is it? Yes. You think, wait a minute, how can both be true? Well, then they say, well, in the gap is where you find God. We can't know everything. And so the Bible presents us with blocks of ideas, and in the gaps there are God. Did Jesus travel one last time to become the Passover lamb? Yes. Was Jesus in town all the time for Sukkot? Yes. And so what you get are different perspectives, and we have to leave some knowledge in between for God alone. However, 2 things are possible here. One, simply John remembers different stuff. John had a disciple, perhaps John himself. Probably not the disciple John because he had been too old, 70 years out, but perhaps dictated by John, who remembered what Jesus said at the other festival, not at Passover. And then also I want to show you something from Zechariah chapter 14, page 776. Yes, when I call out Zechariah, you're glad I have page numbers. I know, it's okay. There's no shame in not being able to find Zechariah in the New Testament. He's not very big, but he is important. Zechariah 14, beginning with the 8th verse, 776. Zechariah had a dream of Sukkot. He did. On the last day, he thought this would happen. On that day, living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. And the Lord will become king over all the earth. And on that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. So now what you see here is when Jesus calls himself living water, he's not just being clever at the festival of Sukkot. He's proclaiming himself to be the Messiah, which is the same thing he does in the Synoptics. So the stories are different, but they get to the same place. On Good Friday, we know that Jesus rode into town on the foal of a donkey. We like it so much that at St. Luke's, like many Episcopal churches, we like to have a donkey, and the children wave palms, and we reenact the event. We all play the game of Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem on that day. You need to know, by the way, somehow we lost. Okay, our donkey died, and it kind of needed to. Ginger, you needed to wash your hands if you pet Ginger after a while. It was just Ginger was looking a little sad, and so by that time, every church in Birmingham has picked up on the donkey thing. We're kind of an influencer that way. And so now there is no donkey, but we have a Shetland pony, which actually is kind of perfect because our children are really well dressed. And someone said, should we just name it Sparkles? Put a horn on it? I don't know. But that's just an aside. What you don't know is that thank you for laughing. What you don't know is that Palm Sunday was not a child's game. It was political theater. A king rode in on the foal of a donkey. We're told in the first book of Kings, chapter 1, that David sends Solomon down on his own mule for a coronation. In other words, foals, donkeys, colts, they mean coronations. They also mean vulnerability. It means that the battle's over. If you're still fighting, you ride in on a war horse. But a small animal like this means that the king has arrived. And so again, for Jesus to say, I'm living water on Sukkot, on the last day, is the same thing as riding in on a foal of a donkey. He's proclaiming himself to be a king. And, of course, this is why they kill him, right? Okay, there are stories that happen in John's gospel that don't happen in the other three. And this is another thing you need to remember, is that Jesus movies are hard to make because they usually gobble up the four into a soup of stories. And you really need to keep the stories in the gospel where they belong because they all tell they have the same trajectory, if you will, or they have their same meta-narrative. So, for instance, in John chapter 4, there's the Samaritan woman at the well. Let's look at that for just a second. So John chapter 4, I'll call it a page number. It's 864. 864. So we'll start with verse 3. Jesus left Judea and started back to Galilee, but he had to go to Samaria. Now, I love John's gospel because it's very descriptive, and this doesn't mean anything to us, but Samaria is no place for Jesus to be. Samaria is the place that we now call the disputed West Bank, and it was trouble then too. Trouble to the point that pilgrims traveling from Jerusalem to Galilee or Galilee to Jerusalem would usually follow the Great Rift Valley down the Jordan River, which is very hot and very dangerous, to avoid Samaritan people. What had happened, and as I've said, there's no fight like a family fight, Samaritans claimed to be the remnants of a people who had been blown off the map some 750 years before Jesus. They were the northern kingdom of Israel. But we're told in 2 Kings chapter 25, I believe, that they were actually repopulated and repeopled. It's very common for the Assyrians, who were the dominant power at that time, to wipe a people off the map. And then what they would do is take Iraqis, I'm using modern anachronistic terms, but Iraqis or Syrians, people from other parts of the world, Arameans, and mix them in with the locals and create kind of a Mesopotamian one world order. So when God's people, who remained different 600 years before Jesus, so now you say you give yourself 150 years, the Babylonians do the very same thing, except the Hebrews don't mix. So they're taken away in exile, and they stay together, and they write down the Bible, and they should be proud of themselves because they come back as stronger, they come back as monotheists. I like to say that St. Luke's is a post-exile story. We came back stronger after the pandemic. We know ourselves better. And so they get back to the work of building the temple. Well, the Samaritans show up, and they say, "Hail, brothers and sisters. This is Ezra chapters 1 through 4, by the way. Maybe we'll get to Ezra in Bible Basics. But that begins a long series of bad Samaritan Jewish relations because the Jewish people say, the Hebrew people say, hey, we've just been in exile, guys, and we didn't blend, and we don't know who you are, but you're just not us, and we're gonna build this on our own. Rats. And the Samaritans go back and they don't like it. And so they build a temple on Mount Gerizim, which is important because you can go there today, and it's a copy-paste of what had existed in Jerusalem but now destroyed by the Romans. So from historic perspective, Samaria is really, really cool for archaeologists because there is a copy-paste temple. They just went and built it. Now, I hope I'm not boring you with this, but I got to add one more thing. Samaritans are a good example of when you get the story just a little wrong. Be careful with religions or denominations or people who just get it just a tad wrong, because you get it a tad wrong and you can go down a rabbit trail. And I'm not being intolerant of other people, but I'll give you an example. So I talked about the 10 Commandments, right? The first 4 are union with God. The last 6 are union with each other. That's it. It's complete. It's the divine mind. The Samaritans tweaked theirs just a little bit. The 10th commandment is not thou shalt not covet, but rather thou shalt build a big honking temple on Mount Gerizim. Okay, which is not what God said, and it just skews the balance, right? And so the Samaritans, for lots of reasons, are places where rabbis like Jesus just shouldn't be there, because you'd get heckled and abused, and as I've said, no fight like a family fight. Let's go back to the story. He left Judea and started back to Galilee, but he had to go through Samaria. And he came to the Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. Okay, it's hot. It's hot over there, and you don't draw water at noon. You don't do it unless you got no friends. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Remember the anachronism now? It probably would have been better saying Galileans, but okay. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God, who it was that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' then you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." He calls himself living water again. And so what you see here is you see Sukkot busting out of the temple precincts and all over the place, even in places like Samaria. You see the beginning of God's love and God's providential care and God's living water in all sorts of places. All right, here's another story that's only found in John. I want to show you how water and Sukkot affects this one. This is John chapter 8, beginning with the 3rd verse. It's on page 870. Now, the woman caught in adultery is only found in John's gospel. And I want to read a few verses to you, and then we're going to stop. But I think we all probably have a passing familiarity with the story. They catch a woman in adultery. They bring her to Jesus. You remember the little detail, what he does while he's waiting? Verse 3, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. And Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And then let her go away, right? So the detail I want you to think about is drawing on the ground. Now, people living in times distant knew the Bible a lot better than we did. And when you mention the law of Moses, and I don't have time to read it this morning, but for those of you who want to geek out on this and write this down, in Numbers chapter 5, it's what to do when a woman caught in adultery is on trial. And the high priest was to take the dust of the ground of the tabernacle and to put it into water and make her drink it. as an indictment against her, and if she made her sick, she was guilty. I mean, that was the law. And so I don't know how many of you have wondered about this story or heard sermons about it or thought about it. What was he doodling on the ground? Was he wasting time? Was he writing her name? You know, I've heard all sorts of little things. Well, if you connect this with the Hebrew Scriptures, you see exactly what he's doing. He's taking the authority, if you will, of a high priest, and he's rendering a judgment. And what's the judgment? Grace. Forgiveness. Yeah, I did hear one preacher say that it probably happened at Sukkot, because when you've got people drinking a lot of wine in a lot of tents, things happen. And so they bring this poor, unfortunate person, and she's caught, right? She's caught. But they don't bring the guy, they just bring the girl. I mean, there's so much hypocrisy in this story. And so what God does is he just simply takes the dust, like they expected him to, and says, I love you. Oh, it's a remarkable gospel. And then finally, I've got just a minute. I'll close with this. Have some fun and read John chapter 21 sometime. John 21, when I was in seminary, they thought John 21 must be a piece of lost John that got stuck on the end because the disciples are fishing again. John 21 is post-Easter, and the disciples say, we're going fishing. And they don't catch anything, and Jesus says, throw your nets on the other side, and suddenly there's this huge catch. Jesus is eating a meal with charcoal fire and a few fish. Oh, yeah, do turn to me because I want you to see this. John chapter 21, and it's on page 884. We'll make time for this. This is fun. So Peter sits beside him, and they have some breakfast, and they eat. And the reason why my teachers thought it was out of place is because it sounds like the beginning of the story, not the end. See, I think it makes perfect sense because post-Easter, how many of us have had a mountaintop experience? Then you got to go back to work. You got to keep living. Can't stop everything, right? Just because you went to Camp McDowell for the weekend. And so what happens on the beach is that Peter sits down after breakfast. This is John 21:15. When they'd finished together, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to them, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. A second time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. He asked him 3 times. What did Peter do 3 times? Just a short while before. Denied his best friend. So what Jesus does in John chapter 21 is he reverses the curse. Just like the woman caught in adultery, Peter's saved by grace. Peter could have become the rock upon which Christ would build this darn thing because he was a guy with scars. He knew he'd messed up. And yet there on the beach, Jesus reverses it. My favorite verse in all Scripture is found in the Synoptics, Mark chapter 16, verse 7. Same story. Empty tomb, mysterious angel in the corner. Go tell the disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you, and Peter. Don't let Peter behind. Don't let him go. Don't let him become Judas. Peter is a man who's saved by grace. And that's the story of all 4. Okay, that's what I've got, guys. Thank y'all very much. Yeah.